On Christmas Day, 1948, a scientist walked into his laboratory outside New York City to check the results of an experiment. What he found that day changed history. He created the global system by which we raise meat animals for our consumption, and though he didn't know it at the time, he also created the conditions for a profound human health threat that would sweep the world. We are still grappling with the results of his discovery, which was that if you add tiny doses of antibiotics to the diets of meat animals, you can make them grow faster and raise them in conditions that are otherwise bad for them. And we are still dealing with the health threat that flowed from that discovery, the undermining of the power of antibiotics in a global epidemic of drug-resistant infections. This is that scientist. His name was Thomas Jukes. He was a native of Britain who emigrated to the United States and became an expert in the dietary needs of chickens. He worked for a pharmaceutical company outside New York City, and in 1948 he went in search of a supplement that would allow farmers to give their animals cheaper, less nutritious feed. So he took a bunch of chickens, he divided them up into groups, and to each group he gave a different supplement. Vitamins, brewer's yeast, cod liver oil, and to one of the groups, the dried up, ground up remains of the drug that his company had just begun manufacturing, a drug called aureomycin, the first tetracycline antibiotic. When he weighed the birds a few weeks later, he discovered that the birds who had gotten the antibiotic leftovers had gained more weight than any other birds in his experiment, and twice as much weight as the birds getting a standard diet. Jukes called this effect growth promotion. And he realized pretty quickly, though he didn't admit to it right away, that what was creating the effect was tiny doses of his company's antibiotic left behind in the manufacturing waste when the drug was strained out. With that recognition, he created a new industry. Within 5 years, the amount of antibiotics being given to livestock just in the United States went from 0 to 500,000 pounds a year. And today in the United States, the total use of antibiotics in animals is almost 31 million pounds. And globally, the amount is believed to be 262 million pounds. And this is important. Almost none of those antibiotics are going to animals that are sick. That's important because whenever we give an antibiotic, we are taking a risk that disease bacteria will adapt to the drug and become resistant, which is to say, will learn to protect themselves against the drug's attack and to survive when they should otherwise have been killed. When we give an antibiotic to a sick human or a sick animal, we're balancing that risk against the benefit of curing an infection. But when we give antibiotics to animals that are not sick, as happens every day in most of the meat animals on the planet, we are tilting the balance of that entirely over toward risk. So how did we get to this point where we routinely give antibiotics to most of the meat animals, the animals that produce our protein on the planet? The history actually goes back to the end of World War II, which is the time when the first antibiotics came on the market. Penicillin, streptomycin, the tetracyclines all arrive between about 1943 and 1948. They are a sensation. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers and sailors come back from the war who would otherwise have died. People who would have died terrible lingering deaths from infectious diseases instead are cured in hours or days. So antibiotics are a huge public good. And for most of the companies that make them, they are also a huge moneymaker. And those companies' desire to make just a little bit more profit from their drugs dovetails very nicely with something else that's going on at the end of the war, which is a profound concern about the stability of the system that produces our food. When the war was beginning, meat producers were encouraged by governments to add infrastructure to produce more meat to feed the troops. When the war was over, that guaranteed market went away, and they had to figure out how to cut their costs to keep the entire sector from collapsing. Something else was going on as well. Because of the devastation of the war, there was profound damage to food supplies and concern about them being fragile. Arable land had been destroyed by battles. Flocks and herds were decimated. Fishing vessels had been co-opted by navies. There were crop failures in Europe and in Asia, and in the United States, there was a disruption in meat production so profound that it was called a meat famine. And it was one of the most important issues in the first election held after the war. To solve those problems and keep meat production inexpensive, producers needed to cut their costs. So they turned to giving their animals less expensive feed. And then they needed inexpensive supplements to make them nutritious enough for the animals to grow. And that was what sent Jukes into his laboratory in 1948 to find a supplement and create this process that still goes on today called growth promotion. Jukes and the researchers who came after him were convinced they had solved this post-war problem of feeding the world. And they saw no downside to what they were doing. And that is extraordinary. Because just a few years before Jukes' experiment, Alexander Fleming, the father of penicillin, the progenitor of all the antibiotics that followed, described in his speech accepting the Nobel Prize in Medicine the exact situation that Jukes would create. He said that if we used low doses of antibiotics, antibiotic-resistant bacteria would develop. Now, he was talking about that in medicine, not in agriculture, but he was right. By 1947, 2 years after he made his speech, penicillin-resistant staphylococcal bacteria began to sweep the world, affecting hospitals first in England, then in Australia, then coming to the western coast of the United States in the mid-1950s. But no one seems to have considered that the same processes that would create antibiotic-resistant bacteria in hospitals would do the exact same thing on farms. So Jukes' process of growth promotion became a routine part of animal production. Pharmaceutical manufacturers advertised it with enthusiasm, not just to make animals grow faster, but also to protect them against the conditions of the new, very large farms that were starting to grow up. And that was a mistake, because the situation that Fleming correctly predicted as happening in medicine happened in agriculture as well. Antibiotic-resistant, foodborne illness, a thing that had never before existed in the world, began to appear. The first signs of trouble are actually in dairy production. Children who drink milk begin to develop penicillin allergies because the cows have been given so much of the antibiotic. Cheesemakers complain that they can't make cheese anymore because the penicillin in the milk kills the beneficial bacteria they use. Then in England, there's an outbreak of drug-resistant salmonella across the entire southeast of the country that makes more than 100 people sick and kills 6 of them. And then there's an outbreak in one small town in the north of England that kills 13 of that town's children. And that, finally, is enough for the world to pay attention. And England goes first. They create the first government controls anywhere in the world on using antibiotics on farms through a commission and then a report and then an act of parliament which says growth promoters shall no longer be legal. Any antibiotic that is important for curing infections in humans should not be used in an animal unless that animal is also sick. And then attention turns to the United States, which is, after all, the home of growth promotion. And this gentleman enters the picture. He's a professor at Tufts University outside Boston. His name is Stuart Levy, and he is still working today. In 1976, he sets up an experimental farm of chickens again. And he locks some chickens in a pen and some other chickens in another pen, and he hires a farm family to feed them all. And to one pen, he gives feed laced with antibiotics, and to another pen, he gives feed that is clean. And in just a few months, antibiotic-resistant bacteria appear, first in the chickens that get the drug-laced feed, then in the chickens that get the clean feed, and then, finally, in the farm family as well. Levy has proved two things. He's proved that routine antibiotic doses affect the guts of animals and human beings, turning what we now call their microbiome, their gut microflora, toward resistance, or increasing the proportion that are resistant. That solves the mystery of antibiotic-resistant foodborne illness arising from meat, because it shows that when animals are slaughtered, the gut contents splash onto the meat and travel with it into home and restaurant kitchens. But he's also showing something that really should have been obvious, which is that giving antibiotics to animals creates a risk while they are alive as well, because those gut contents travel via their manure into the farm environment and then into the larger environment and create a risk of drug-resistant bacteria flowing through the world that is untrackable. His discovery prompts the US Food and Drug Administration, a cabinet-level agency, to try to do the same controls that England has done, and he is unsuccessful. Our national legislature, our Congress, blocks it in service to agricultural interests. And at that point, Britain and the rest of Europe and the United States diverge on antibiotic control, presenting two models which even today the rest of the world can copy, including the global South. Europe and the Scandinavian countries and then the entire European Union ban growth promotion. The latest ban was in 2006. The United States does nothing until just last year, instead allowing things to be empirical, waiting to see if drug-resistant bacteria emerge. And they do. In 1987, hundreds of people fall ill in California as a result of ground beef from dairy cows that have been dosed with antibiotics. In 2001, researchers in Minnesota proved that hundreds and thousands of urinary tract infections, something that affects most women in the world at least once in their lives, are due to resistant bacteria traveling on meat. Starting in 2006, researchers across the United States show that if you live near a large farm, you are at risk from drug-resistant bacteria traveling away from farms on the wind, on dust, in groundwater, in surface water, on the feet of insects and rodents, and even on the clothing and the skin of farm workers themselves. And these outbreaks are not confined to the United States. In 2004, the Netherlands is swamped by an epidemic of drug-resistant staph, MRSA, that arises in pigs given tetracycline and travels from them to farm families and then into the rest of the society and creates an outbreak so profound that to this day, if you are a pig farmer in the Netherlands, you will be inspected as you enter a hospital to make sure that it is not necessary to put you in isolation to protect the rest of the hospital patients. And just in 2015, researchers in China and Britain showed that in China, drug-resistant bacteria resistant to the very last resort antibiotic that we have, a drug called colistin, arose in pigs in China, moved to people and to pork in supermarkets, and now has moved across the world to more than 35 countries. It's that discovery that drives home how profound this problem really is. Routine antibiotic use in the animals that deliver our protein is contributing to a worldwide epidemic of drug-resistant infections that we do not take seriously enough. It's been estimated that right now, the toll just in the United States is 23,000 deaths a year, and 2 million people sick enough to go to the doctor or a hospital, 25,000 in the European Union, possibly 700,000 people around the world dying from drug-resistant infections. And if those trends cannot be gotten under control, by 2050, possibly 10 million deaths a year, and a cost to the world of $100 trillion. Now, those are difficult numbers to make sense of, so let me give you an example of what they mean. When I came to this lovely city on Saturday, I came on an aircraft that holds about 300 people. The toll of antibiotic resistance in the world right now is one of those aircraft crashing and killing everyone on board every 6 hours. If we do not get these trends under control, the toll of antibiotic resistance in the year 2050 will be one of those international aircraft crashing every 15 minutes. Put that another way, one death every 3 seconds all around the world. By our overindulgence in antibiotics, we have brought ourselves to the edge of a post-antibiotic world, a world in which we could lose most of what we think of as modern medicine, and also much of the confidence with which we live our everyday lives. If we lost antibiotics, if we went back to the days before penicillin, we would lose protection for anyone with a diminished immune system, anyone with cancer, anyone with HIV, anyone who's had an organ transplant. We would lose treatments that put things in the body, pumps for diabetes, stents to prevent a second stroke. We would lose the kind of protection that antibiotics gave us. We don't remember this because we were all born within the antibiotic era. But strep throat used to cause heart failure. Pneumonia killed 3 children out of every 10. Skin infections, minor cuts, led to amputations. Giving birth killed in the cleanest hospitals 9 women out of every 1,000, and often many more. Think about this. If you knew that any injury, no matter how small, could threaten your life, how would you change the way you live? Would you bomb down a ski slope? Would you ride a motorcycle? Would you let your child slide across the turf for a goal? These are the things that are threatened by our overuse of antibiotics in medicine, but in agriculture even more so. So what do we do? It's very important that we have this conversation here. Most of the global South has not yet set curbs on antibiotic use in food, and it is crucial to change that. Brazil is now the world's largest exporter of chicken, and also one of the countries with the highest consumption of antibiotics for agricultural use. And here in Chile, though most of the world's focus has been on animals on the land, this concern is just as profound for animals in the sea. Chile is one of the world's top salmon producers, but it struggles with its antibiotic use, just 2 years ago racking up the highest antibiotic use ever in that industry to protect against a fish disease. We do not know, because the disease surveillance is not strong enough, whether this is causing illnesses in Chile, but we do know that it is harming Chile's international reputation, because very large corporations are turning away from Chilean salmon and choosing the salmon of other countries such as Norway that raises its fish in an antibiotic-free way. The question we have to ask is, for the good of the world, can we change our habits of using antibiotics so freely? And can governments change their attitude toward antibiotic use? And I think the answer is yes. In 2014, the American chicken company Purdue Farms, the 4th largest chicken producer in the United States, announced that it was going completely antibiotic-free, and now, 3 years later, is 99% antibiotic-free. In 2016, the central government of China, the central government of China, which was alarmed by the reports of those bacteria moving across the world, resistant to the very last resort antibiotic colistin, wrote a law that withdrew that drug from availability to its farmers, took 8,000 tons of the drug out from agricultural use. And in 2017, finally, the US government, after almost 40 years of stalemate, finally created regulations that control growth promoters, though not all antibiotic use. And these are encouraging moves, and they are crucial for the rest of the world to follow. The global South, the economies of developing nations, are where the crucial battles over antibiotic use in medicine, but even more in agriculture, will be won or lost. As the economies of developing nations improve, it is natural for those nations to grow and eat more meat. It's natural for them to turn to intensive agriculture and intensive aquaculture, and it is natural for them also to turn to antibiotic use unless they can be persuaded of the risks. It is essential that the citizens of the South speak to their governments and alert them to this threat, and that the countries of the South do recognize the risk and join with industrialized nations to take routine antibiotics out of protein agriculture forever. The great microbiologist Joshua Lederberg once said, "There is nowhere in the world from which we are remote, For the overuse of antibiotics, we have not yet learned that lesson. I think we do not have much time left to get it right. Thank you very much.